And then if we care, what is our explanation for why we have such persistent inequality? And so this is the point about asking the question, are white men smarter? Because if they are smarter, then that's the end of the argument.
When I first saw the title of this book, I had one reaction. Oh, no, he did not. And if that was your reaction too, good. That means you're paying attention. But before you decide what you think this conversation is about, I need you to stay with me for a minute. Because this book is not about attacking anyone. It's not a rage piece. It's not political warfare. What Steve Phillips has written is a question that he says nobody in power wants to answer. White men are 29% of this country, and yet they hold 90% of CEO positions, 90% of venture capital, and 99% of all the presidencies in the United States. So if we believe in merit, what explains that gap? Either something in the system is producing that outcome, or we believe that white men are just built differently. Nobody wants to say that out loud, which means we have some explaining to do. And this is a conversation with Steve Phillips about his book entitled, Are White Men Smarter Than Everybody Else? Playing Offense in the Fight for Racial Justice in America. I have to start with the title. Because when I first saw it, I was like, ooh, he did not. Walk me through it. Why did you go there?
So originally, I was just wanting to focus in on, but I wanted to focus in on what happened to the commitments around racial justice after George Floyd was killed. And so, fundamentally, I wrote this book and I titled this book because I actually still believe in the words and the ideas in these words that were articulated by white men, that this country is conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all are created equal. And so I wanted to ask that question. So the original working title of the book was, Does All Mean All? And that we say all are created equal. Do we really believe that? We have all this inequality, try to remind people of that. Then we had 2024 and then the 2025 really, blitzkrieg of attacks on all remedies and efforts to bring about equality. So all of this, you have the juxtaposition of the widespread agreement that we have systemic racism in this country that has resulted in widespread inequality, and we have to do something about it. And then 5-6 years later, you have the complete abandonment, and not just the abandonment of those commitments. And that's what led to the shift in the title. And so the abandonment had begun even before this administration came in. And so people were, with backtracking in their commitments, waffling on going forward, Supreme Court affirmative action decision, et cetera, all predated this current president coming into office. But it was the attack on the remedies. And so without saying anything about the underlying inequality, DEI exists to address the inequality in our society, affirmative action similarly. And so this gleeful, unapologetic assault on the remedies to inequality without making any comment about the underlying inequality and its persistence, that's what led me to feel that we have to try to change this conversation, go back on the offensive, and frankly, respond with commensurate force in defending the push for equality as we are experiencing from those attacking those who want to bring about inequality. And so that's what I wanted to put before the country, is that we once said we cared about inequality, and then we backtracked on that, and now we're attacking all of these remedies. And so what do we think about this underlying inequality? And are we in fact saying that white men are smarter? And that's why, that there is no more need for any kind of program to address inequality or injustice, that the status quo is just fine in the natural course of things. And so that's why I wanted to force people to ask that question, because I do think that it's plain as day, it's in front of our face, but nobody wants to say it and nobody wants to engage in it. And so that was the thinking. And then frankly, it's also a way to help us shift the conversation from being defensive around trying to this program is good or it's doing something. The truth of the matter is that a lot of people of color thought that DEI and affirmative action were insufficient. and we're actually not the ideal full-throated program that we actually need to have. So that's the other piece, is that changing the orientation from the underrepresentation of people of color, which leads itself logically to a deficit model and looking at, well, what's wrong with people of color? Do they don't have enough education, or their families are broken, or they don't have enough mentoring, they're not going to school enough? That's what a lot of people are actually saying on the right. It's a whole different conversation to why is there this overrepresentation of white men in these positions? And that's a different inquiry. And frankly, I think it's an inquiry that has far more empirical and scientific justification and force behind it in terms of explaining what's going on in our society.
Well, I think you got me to my next question because I think that that was the other thing that I thought really stood out was that you're saying that we've been asking the wrong question for 50 years instead of asking why there has been so few Black and brown people in power. What we should be asking is another question. And can you kind of clarify what that question we should be asking and why should we be asking that question?
Well, first of all, it's a question of do we care about the inequality? So that's part of the inquiry and the provocation, frankly, that I'm trying to foster in our national discourse. And then if we can say that we do care, then we have to understand why does this exist? And again, so part of it, you can draw the conclusion that there's something wrong and lacking and deficient in the communities of color. But if you flip that, because the other side of that same coin of the underrepresentation of people of color is the overrepresentation of white men. And if you look there, that's a different inquiry. And I would posit that there's a lot more empirical, academic, scientific research that explain that reality is what explains this underlying persistent inequality. And so we're trying to reframe the conversation, and we're trying to do so by promoting this concept of what we're calling straight white American male preference, which spells out swamp. And so we are trying to say there should be swamp audits, swamp analysis, indexes. White men are 29% of the country, and yet they hold 90% of the CEO positions. They get 90% of the venture capital funding. They've had, what, 98% or whatever of the presidents of the United States. And so what is that about? And so that's a different inquiry, that's a different set of solutions. And so rather than trying to like fix people of color and fix women for not being in these positions, it's to force people to realize and grapple with that there is ongoing contemporary active preference being shown to white men. And that's a different situation than the way we've been going about addressing inequality in this country.
I think you have to, for someone who's listening who hasn't read the book yet, explain what SWAMP stands for, which is very interesting. And then I guess give people, let's say a student is listening to this right now and they really want to apply this audit, like you say, at their own school. What do they actually do?
Right. So SWAMP is the acronym for straight white American male preference. And that's what we're asserting is shown. And there's ample and abundant empirical evidence that this is, in fact, the case in terms of how decisions get made, how people think, how people function. There was actually, it was a white male consultant. I was at a conference once, and he had this comment. He says, we like people who are like us.
Mm.
In that if we have a country then where you could only, it was created where the only people who could vote, let alone hold office or positions of power, were property holding white men, then that replicates itself with each successive generation that moves forward. And that's what you see in terms of the venture capital within this country, is that the venture capitalists are largely white men who resonate with and see in the entrepreneurs people like them, and that's who they tend to take a chance on or move money to, et cetera. And so a situation continues to perpetuate itself. And there's abundant scientific evidence around this. And so Jennifer Eberhardt, a professor at Stanford, and was a MacArthur genius. So she wrote this book, Bias, where she goes into these different pieces. John Powell, at the UC Berkeley's. It runs the Center for Othering and Belonging. It's done extensive research around how implicit bias works, how the brain actually functions in terms of categorizing people to help it make decisions and whatnot. And so that reality leads towards there being this active default preference in terms of who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets given positions of power, who gets elected. And that's what we're trying to focus on in terms of offering people this lens and this analysis of swamp as an explanation for the inequality that exists. And so really it's a very simple audit analysis using the benchmark of 29%. The positions of power, of influence, of decision-making, white men should roughly be hold around 29% of those positions. But they hold 80, 90, about 100% of those positions in so many different entities. And so for a campus, students should look at the positions of power in that university or in that college. Who are the presidents? Who are the top administrators? Who are the tenured faculty in the top positions? What percentage of those positions are held by white men? And what does that percentage look like compared to the 29% that they would have if it were an actual meritocracy and equally distributed? And that becomes your level of overrepresentation. And then if you show that there is overrepresentation, and spoiler alert, there is almost everywhere, then it's forcing a conversation. And so that's where I feel it's also going on the offensive rather than defensive, is you can take that data and then you can hold a forum on campus and just ask the question. White men are overrepresented in these different positions. Why is that?
Well, if this is a conversation that's making you think, good. That's the point. If you work with young people, I want you to know that I have quite a few stories on this platform that will make your students think and hold meaningful conversations about. I'm talking about my Erase series, where I bring to life stories that were nearly erased from history. I've been spending time trying to find them. And I've created educator bundles that gives teachers everything they need to bring this history into the classroom. Discussion guides, lesson plans, and slides. And the link is in the description, so please check it out. And if you haven't subscribed, please hit that button. It's free and it helps me continue doing the work on this platform. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
And leave it at that. That puts other people on the defensive, forces them to grapple with it. And then we can then move to, okay, what are we going to do about it? And that's where I feel like what this moment demands is that inquiry, that candid and, close look at what's actually going on. And then we can pivot towards new solutions for this new era.
I saw that you started writing this book expecting a totally different political moment, and then November 24 happened. How did that change what you wrote and how you wrote it?
Well, that was the pivot from does all mean all. And I thought we would be in an environment where people would agree that that we should be addressing inequality and that we should be trying to do something about the levels of overrepresentation that we have. And that was the spirit, and that was the dominant ideology and the dominant thinking after George Floyd was killed. Everybody was saying that systemic racism is a problem and we should do about it, and that we're falling short of the country's goals that all are created equal. And so when this administration came in and really jettisoned a lot of that premise, I mean, we have not had an administration in over 100 years go after and try to attack the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which was created after the bloodiest war in the history of this country, in the Civil War, in which the equivalent of 7 million people, by today's numbers, it was 2% of the U.S. population, were killed in a war over whether this would be a white nationalist nation or whether this would be a multiracial democracy. So this climate shifted to where there became this aggressive attack on the concept of moving the country towards being a multiracial democracy. And so that's where I felt like we had to change the posture and the positioning and really put a stake in the ground that what are we really saying here? And as with all of this backtracking and retreating from all these different institutions who are capitulating to the threats of this administration, that we need to bring people back to those core principles. Do you care about the inequality? What is your explanation? And is your explanation simply that white men are smarter, therefore we don't have to do anything? So is that what you're saying? And no one wants to say that. And so if you do agree that that's not the situation, then you need to do something, and then we can push people to go back on offensive.
I always love it when a person kind of explains what's going on and then says, okay, now that we know what's going on or we have an idea, what action can we do to take and move this forward? And you kind of already covered a little bit of it. I think that perhaps there might be a little bit more. So perhaps is that what you're just saying, that we should bring ourselves to those powers that be and then propose a question and then leave it there and then move in a different direction? What is your, I guess, next step?
Well, I think this moment it was interesting. I went and I spoke at to a political science class at a college, and so there was a lot of a spectrum of reactions to this concept and of are white men smarter. And so some people were trying to push to, well, what are you saying? Or what's your solution? And I think there was a desire to try to have me put something out there that they could then attack. I don't think that that's what this era calls for. The remedies that were developed and that have been advanced and promoted and put forward are all coming under withering attack and and in many cases have actually been destroyed and gutted. So that creates a situation where I feel two things have to happen. We have to return to, do we care about making this country a country that is rooted in and committed to the concept that all are created equal? So that's one. We have to force that conversation. And then if we care, what is our explanation for why we have such persistent inequality? And so this is the point about asking the question, are white men smarter? Because if they are smarter, then that's the end of the argument. And then we don't have to do any kind of reforms or programs. And it's just natural selection. And the smartest and the most talented have risen to these positions. But if that's not the case, and even this current president of the United States has not been able to bring himself to say those words out loud, if that's not the case, then we have to turn ourselves to looking at what do we do. And so I feel like that's the imperative of this hour. And that gets back to, so when the current president signed the executive order eliminating affirmative action, I had two reactions. One was, well, first, that program had lasted for 60 years. And so that, in some level, that's kind of a model for this moment is what are we going to do that's going to last for another 60 years? But also that it had not done the job. We had not achieved equality even 60 years later. It's profound racial wealth gap, profound gender pay gap, et cetera. And so I feel it's the task of this moment of young people, of activists, of organizers, is to reimagine, really to free our minds from the constraints of the past, which is another thing that this administration has done and this Supreme Court. You don't have to be bound by any of the limitations of the past. You can just imagine what you want society to be, what its priorities should be, and what we should be doing as a government. And we saw during the pandemic what's possible, right? In that when the first COVID relief bill was passed, within a matter of like days, if not weeks, it was like $1 trillion package. And I remember somebody tweeting out at that point, and they said, oh, so we could afford reparations, right? And so what is possible in our society is much greater than we have been led to believe. We didn't have to all get into cars, drive to big buildings, sit in those buildings and work there in order for the society to function. We could, in fact, send checks to almost every single American who needed it. We could forestall people being kicked out of their homes. That paints a template of what society could be. Why can't the richest country in the history of the world end poverty? Why can't that country provide housing and quality education for every single person? So all of that is is doable if we have the vision and the courage to do it. And so rather than us defend these programs from the past, let's free our minds and be as ambitious and bold and aggressive as possible going forward in terms of creating a new program and a new era of what society should look like.
I think also when reading your book, it sounds as if there is a lot of people might say this is a moral argument or a feelings argument or a feelings moment, but you also make a legal argument. You say that the framework to fight it already exists, as you just said. So I guess what legal grounds are we kind of standing on that need to be kind of reframed or reworked?
So that's one of the interesting things about this moment, because a lot of the people who have come into power and are attacking all of these efforts around that to foster equality are in some ways being too clever by half. And so they're trying to use civil rights laws to be able to attack efforts to bring about equality. And but in the process, they are affirming these civil rights laws. And so that's the other advantage, frankly, from a strategic and tactical standpoint, is that so let's say, yes, there should not be any preferences, because they're trying to use that as the basis for attacking affirmative action. There should not be preferences, so stop showing preferences to white men. And that's a different way to actually flip that script and to then also put them on the defensive. And so there is legal precedent that looks at this, and you see this level of discrepancy, that in itself is evidence of there being an improper and illegal programs and practices. So there's that measure to it. And so that is, I think, a way we can try to turn the tables around this in terms of rethinking our strategies and how we go forward.
And you end the book with something called Project 2126, 100 years from now. Why did you go that far out? And what are you asking people to hold on to?
So for two reasons. One is that there's been a lot of, like, in the progressive side, like, oh, we need a Project 2029 in terms of, because Trump came in with this Project 2025, et cetera. First of all, the Project 2025 was 40 years in the making. It goes back to 1979 when the Heritage Foundation put together this mandate for change. I actually bought it on eBay, the 1979 version. It's 800 pages long, and it has all of these plans and programs. It says in there, interesting, in the appendix, that you can't use executive orders. They're not an effective way to move forward. So this is how far we've come from there. So that was just the culmination of 40 years of work. So that's the first piece. This is not just a quick fix in terms of this moment that we're in, the level of attack that we're facing. And the other is what I was saying about the affirmative action law. It lasted for 60 years. And so what are we going to be doing? What plans, programs, policies, initiatives that will last at least for the rest of this century? Because 60 years from now, right, takes us close to the end of the century. And so to reframe it from, this is not just a time to restore a specific endeavor that was undone by this current administration. It's to rethink the entirety of the public policy agenda around what the country could and should be, and to put that forward with great deal of boldness and confidence in terms of creating the kind of country that we want to see, which is the country that the founding fathers said, where we were dedicated to this proposition that all are created equal.
Mm. Last question. And I think I ask this because a lot of educators and young people might be listening to this. If someone finishes the book, they're really fired up, what's the very first thing that you want them to do tomorrow morning?
I'm more encouraging people to really raise this question in whatever circle they are in. And so I've been talking actually with Stacey Abrams around some of this, who's done a lot of this work of defending DEI through her American Pride Rising organization, and she talks about this minimum viable community. Or there's a concept in the entrepreneurial world, a minimum viable product. So what's your minimum viable community? Is it 5 people? Is it 10 people? Getting together in your particular area and then asking whatever entities you are connected to, doing your own little mini swamp audits. Is there overrepresentation of white men in this particular realm, in your school, in your school board, in your neighborhood, or whatnot? And then forcing that conversation and just asking the question, we found this overrepresentation. What do we think about it? Why does it exist? What are we doing about it?
Steve Phillips said something that's really important. He said, free your mind. Don't defend the programs of the past. Build something for the future that lasts. I think about that in the context of what we do here on this show, in the classroom, or in our communities. the work of making sure that stories that we know about that are history don't get erased. The book is called Are White Men Smarter Than Everybody Else? Playing Offense in the Fight for Racial Justice in America. The link is in the description. And if this conversation moved you, pass it along to somebody else who needs to hear it. I'm Esther Dillard, and remember, your story matters.